The leather belt whistled through the scorching New Mexico air with vicious precision, striking Clara's thin shoulders and leaving an angry red welt that would darken by evening. The 9-year-old girl stumbled forward, but refused to cry out. 3 years of bitter experience had taught her that screams only fed her stepfather's rage like kindling on a fire. Behind her, 7-year-old Jacob pressed himself against a sun-bleached boulder, his small frame trembling as fresh marks crisscrossed his bare back like crimson lightning. Worthless burdens. Amos Kettering roared his words, saturated with the whiskey that had become his constant companion since dawn. His bloodshot gaze blazed with drunken fury as he raised the belt again, swaying on unsteady legs. Eating my food, drinking my water, and what do I get? Nothing but complaints and weakness. The isolated road stretched endlessly through the harsh New Mexico territory in this merciless summer of 1872, flanked by towering red sandstone cliffs that trapped heat like a furnace. No shade offered relief from the relentless sun. No water source promised hope, and no other travelers appeared to witness this savage display. The only sounds were Amos's labored breathing, the children's muffled whimpers, and the distant cry of vultures circling overhead like harbingers of death. Clara instinctively raised her arms to shield her face. But something felt different about this beating. More calculated, more deliberate than his usual drunken violence. Around Amos's neck hung a small leather pouch that clinked softly with coins, more money than their family had seen in months. Where had it come from, and why did his stare drift repeatedly toward the dusty trail leading to Dusty Fork every few minutes, as if expecting someone? Before she could decipher these disturbing details, the thunder of approaching hooves suddenly shattered the desert silence. A magnificent bay stallion appeared around the bend, its rider sitting tall with the fluid grace of someone born to wilderness survival. The horse's powerful muscles rippled beneath its glossy coat as it devoured ground with long, smooth strides. Steam rose from its nostrils in the blazing heat, and the animal's intelligent eyes showed the alertness of a creature that had carried its master through countless perils. The rider commanded attention like a force of nature. Tall and imposing, his broad shoulders were draped in a deerskin shirt, decorated with intricate beadwork that caught sunlight like scattered jewels. Eagle feathers adorned his long black hair, and his weathered face bore deep lines carved by years of hardship and loss. Most striking were his dark eyes. They didn't merely burn with anger, they smoldered with a controlled fury that spoke of personal tragedy and unfinished justice. The warrior brought his stallion to a halt 20 feet away, the animal dancing nervously as it sensed the electric tension crackling through the air. For a heartbeat that stretched into eternity, nobody moved. The silence was so complete that Clara could hear her own pulse racing, punctuated only by Jacob's barely audible breathing and the soft creak of leather as Amos shifted his weight. Then the warrior spoke, his voice carrying the deadly calm of a gathering storm. "Sell them to me." The simple words struck Amos like a physical blow. He blinked rapidly, certain the morning's whiskey was distorting his hearing. What did you say, Redskin?" The Navajo dismounted with liquid grace, his moccasined feet touching earth without sound. One hand rested casually on the carved bone handle of his knife, while the other held his horse's reins with practiced ease. "You heard me clearly. Name your price for the children." Clara and Jacob froze like startled deer, their eyes wide with desperate hope they barely dared acknowledge. Never in their short, harsh lives had anyone challenged Amos's absolute authority over them. Amos's face twisted into an ugly sneer that revealed teeth stained yellow by tobacco and neglect. "You got nerve riding up here telling me how to handle my own blood. These children belong to me by legal right, and I'll discipline them however I see fit." But even as he spoke these words, Clara caught something peculiar, a slight hesitation when he said, "My own blood," as if the phrase tasted wrong in his mouth. She filed this observation away in the corner of her mind that had learned to catalog inconsistencies as potential weapons. The warrior, whose name was Dasan, though Clara wouldn't learn this for hours yet, took a measured step closer. His hand never left his weapon, but his movement carried no overt threat. No child belongs to a man who beats them like diseased animals. State your price, and we can settle this peacefully. Dasan's presence here was no coincidence of timing or simple compassion for abused children. 3 years ago, in the spring of 1869, white raiders had swept down on his family's small camp like wolves on defenseless sheep. They had stolen his 12-year-old brother, lawless, along with 2 other children from neighboring families. By the time Dasan had tracked them to a silver mine in Colorado Territory, following a trail of broken promises and blood money, lawless had already died in a tunnel collapse after months of forced labor. The mine owner had simply dumped the boy's body in an unmarked grave and purchased another child to replace him. That loss had nearly shattered Dasan's spirit completely. For months afterward, he had wandered the wilderness, consumed by grief so profound it felt like physical illness. But gradually, as winter gave way to spring, his anguish had transformed into something more purposeful, a burning determination to prevent other children from suffering his brother's fate. For 3 years now, he had traveled the frontier settlements and trading routes, intercepting the sale of children wherever he encountered it. He had saved 17 young lives in those years, finding them homes with families who understood that children were precious gifts rather than economic burdens. Now, seeing Clara's stoic courage in the face of brutality and Jacob's terrified vulnerability, every protective instinct Dasan possessed roared to life with volcanic intensity. Amos raised the belt higher, pointing it at Dasan like a weapon. "Get back on that nag and ride away before I give you a taste of what these brats are getting. This is family business, and it's got nothing to do with some wandering savage." The word family seemed to stick in Amos's throat, and Clara felt another piece of an unidentified puzzle click into place. Why did he always sound so reluctant to claim them as his own? Why did he never mention resemblances or shared traits the way other parents did? That last warning, Redskin. Amos slurred his grip, tightening on the leather strap. "Leave now, or I'll—" He never finished the threat. Dasan moved like striking lightning, covering the distance between them in 2 fluid strides. His left hand shot out and caught Amos's wrist in an iron grip, freezing the belt inches from Clara's upturned face. His right hand drew the knife in one smooth motion, the steel blade gleaming wickedly in the desert sun. "No," Dasan said with deadly quiet. "Last warning for you." Amos's whiskey-fueled bravado crumbled as he found himself staring into eyes that held no trace of mercy or hesitation. He tried to pull away, but Dasan's grip was unbreakable. The warrior twisted Amos's arm behind his back, with controlled force, making him drop the belt with a soft thud that raised a small cloud of dust. "I won't hurt him unless he forces me to," Dasan told Clara gently, his voice warming with compassion, even as his gaze remained fixed on Amos. Then, addressing the drunk man directly, "But he will never raise a hand to you again." Dasan released his grip and stepped back, keeping the knife ready while reaching into a leather pouch at his belt. He withdrew a small bag that clinked softly with the unmistakable sound of silver coins. This should buy enough supplies to last through winter or seed for spring planting. "Take it and let the children come with me where they'll be safe." Amos stared at the offered payment with naked greed, warring against something darker in his expression. Not paternal love, but cold calculation that made Clara's spine chill with foreboding. Silver. Amos laughed harshly, the sound like breaking glass. "You think that little bag is worth 2 healthy workers, mister. You don't understand the first thing about business. Silas Crane up in Dusty Fork pays top dollar for children their size. Strong backs small enough for the narrow mine tunnels, they're worth 10 times what you're offering." The casual way Amos discussed selling his stepchildren like livestock sent waves of nausea through Clara's stomach. But it also confirmed her growing suspicions about the true nature of their relationship. A real father wouldn't speak of his offspring with such detached calculation. Dasan's expression darkened at the mention of Crane's name. He had heard that name whispered fearfully in trading posts throughout the territory, the mine owner who purchased children like cattle and worked them to death in his silver operations. Silas Crane is a killer of children. Dasan said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. If you sell them to him, you'll never see them alive again. Amos shrugged with callous indifference. That's his problem to solve. My problem is getting the best price for my investment. The word investment hit Clara like a slap. Combined with all his earlier hesitations and the emotional distance he had always maintained, the truth began crystallizing with horrifying clarity. But before she could fully process these revelations, Amos turned and began walking rapidly toward the trail that led to Dusty Fork. "Where are you going?" Clara called after him, though dread was already providing the answer. "To close a business deal." Amos shouted back without slowing his pace. "Crane's always looking for new workers, and he pays double for children with spirit. You two just earned me enough money to start fresh somewhere else." The naked betrayal in his words shattered whatever fragile hopes Clara might have harbored about their relationship. This man felt no protective instinct, no familial bond, no connection beyond cold financial opportunity. "Come," Dasan said urgently, moving to help the children. "We must leave immediately before he returns with Crane's men." Clara took his offered hand without hesitation, her mind already racing ahead to calculate their chances of escape. As they hurried toward Dasan's horse, she couldn't shake the feeling that darker secrets lay hidden beneath the surface of their family's history, secrets that might explain not just Amos's cruelty, but the very foundation of everything she had believed about her life. The scorching sun continued its relentless journey across the cloudless sky as they fled deeper into the wilderness, unaware that their encounter had triggered events that would expose buried truths and demand a terrible reckoning with the past. The trading post at Willow Creek squatted beside its namesake stream like a patient animal, its weathered adobe walls offering the first real shelter Clara and Jacob had known in days. Dasan had chosen their sanctuary with military precision. The location provided fresh water from a reliable spring, defensible positions if they were pursued, and multiple escape routes through the surrounding maze of canyons and arroyos. As Clara helped Jacob clean his wounds in the cool stream water, she found herself studying Dasan's weathered features, searching for clues about what drove this stranger to risk his life for children he barely knew. The answer came as he tended their injuries with gentle, experienced hands that spoke of someone who had cared for the wounded before. "You lost someone close to you," Clara said softly. It wasn't a question. She had learned to read the signs of grief in adults during her years with Amos. Dasan's movement stilled for a heartbeat. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of unhealed sorrow. "My brother, Nalnish. He was Jacob's age when raiders took him and sold him to a mine owner who worked him to death underground. I'm sorry," Clara whispered. But her analytical mind was already working on larger implications. If Dasan's brother had been stolen and sold, then the trade in children was more extensive than she had imagined. Amos wasn't just one cruel stepfather. He was part of a systematic network that treated children like commodities. But there was something else nagging at her consciousness, an inconsistency she couldn't quite identify. As they prepared to venture deeper into the wilderness, Clara pulled out the small wooden locket that had belonged to her mother, one of the few possessions Amos hadn't sold to buy whiskey. She had carried it for years without examining it closely, but now something about its weight suggested hidden depths. The catch was tiny and corroded, but with patient work she managed to pry it open. Inside, folded with extraordinary care, were several pieces of paper that had been concealed there for years. The first was her parents' marriage certificate, but the date made Clara's pulse race with shock. Her mother had married Thomas Hartwell 6 months before Clara was born. Amos Kettering appeared nowhere on the legal document. The second paper was even more startling, a brief note in her mother's careful handwriting Dearest Clara, if you read this, then I am gone, and you have discovered what I could never bear to tell you. Thomas Hartwell was your real father, a good man, who died in a mining accident before Jacob was born. I married Amos in desperation, thinking you needed a father figure. I was wrong. You are not his blood, and you owe him nothing. But beware, Amos knows more about your father's death than he admits. The sickness that took me was not natural. Trust no one completely until you understand the full truth. Clara's mind reeled as the implications crashed over her like an avalanche. Amos wasn't their father at all, just a stepfather who had never wanted them. Worse, her mother had suspected he was capable of something terrible. Clara, Jacob asked, noticing her pale expression and shaking hands. What's wrong? Before she could answer, the distant sound of approaching horses echoed through the canyon. Multiple riders moving fast and with deadly purpose. Dasan was already gathering their meager supplies, his expression grim. Crane's men, he said tersely. They've found our trail sooner than expected. We need to move immediately. As they hurriedly mounted their horses and fled deeper into the wilderness, Clara clutched the locket and its terrible revelations. The knowledge that Amos had been lying about their family relationship gave new urgency to their flight if he had deceived them about being their father. What other lies had shaped their entire lives? The chase that followed tested every survival skill Dasan had learned during his years as a scout and tracker. Crane's men were professionals who could read sign like printed text and predict their quarry's movements with deadly accuracy. But the Navajo warrior knew wilderness craft that had kept his people alive for generations, and he used every trick of concealment and misdirection to stay ahead of their pursuers. They rode through landscapes that transformed from red desert to pine-covered mountains to rocky badlands, always moving north toward distant peaks. Sometimes they could see dust clouds on the horizon, marking their hunters' progress. Sometimes they could hear gunshots echoing off canyon walls as the pursuit tested their range. On their second evening of flight, as they made camp in a sheltered grove beside a mountain stream, Dasan finally allowed them their first real rest since leaving Willow Creek. The children were exhausted and their faces gaunt with hunger and stress, but their spirits remained unbroken. Tell us about your brother, Clara said as they sat around their small fire sharing the last of their dried meat. What was Nalnish like? Dasan was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes reflecting the flickering flames. When he spoke, his voice carried both love and pain. He was curious about everything. Dasan began. Always asking questions, always wanting to understand how things worked. He could track a rabbit through solid rock, or so it seemed to me when I was trying to teach him hunting skills. But what I remember most was his laugh. It sounded like water running over smooth stones. Jacob leaned closer, drawn to this glimpse of another boy who had faced dangers similar to their own. Was he brave? The bravest person I ever knew, Dasan replied. Not because he wasn't afraid, but because he did what needed to be done, despite being afraid. When the raiders came, he tried to protect the younger children. That's how they captured him. He could have run, but he stayed to help others. Clara felt tears stinging her eyes as she imagined a 12-year-old boy making the same kind of protective choices she had been making for Jacob. Do you think he would have liked us? Dasan smiled, the first genuinely happy expression Clara had seen from him. He would have loved you both. He always said the best families were the ones people chose for themselves, not the ones they were born into. As if summoned by the mention of chosen families, Jacob curled up closer to Clara and Dasan, creating a small circle of warmth and safety in the vast wilderness. For a few precious hours, they weren't fugitives fleeing for their lives. They were simply three people who had found each other in a world that had tried to tear them apart. But their peace was shattered at dawn by the sound of pursuit growing dangerously close. By the time they broke camp and resumed their flight, Clara could see individual riders in the distance, close enough to make out details of their clothing and weapons. How do they keep finding us? Jacob asked as they pushed their horses to a punishing pace up a narrow mountain trail. Dasan had been wondering the same thing. Their route changes had been unpredictable, their campfires smokeless, their tracks carefully concealed wherever possible. Yet somehow Crane's men always seemed to know approximately where they were heading. The answer came as they crested a high ridge and looked back at their pursuers through Dasan's spyglass. Among the mounted men, Clara spotted a familiar figure that made her blood freeze with recognition and betrayal. "Miguel Santos," she whispered, hardly believing her eyes. Miguel was a Mexican laborer where they had encountered at a trading post during their first day of flight. He had seemed sympathetic to their plight, even sharing food from his own meager supplies and offering advice about safe routes through the mountains. Clara had trusted him instinctively. He had spoken kindly to Jacob and had seemed genuinely concerned about their welfare. Now he was riding with their hunters, serving as a guide through country he claimed to know better than anyone. "Who is that?" Dasan asked, following Clara's horrified gaze. "Someone who helped us." Clara replied, her voice tight with bitter understanding. "Someone I trusted completely." The implications hit her like a physical blow. Miguel hadn't been a chance encounter at the trading post. He had been planted there specifically to gain their confidence and track their movements. Every piece of advice he had given, every route he had suggested, had been designed to funnel them toward predetermined kill zones. But as Clara watched Miguel pointing out landmarks to Crane's other men, she noticed something in his posture and expression that didn't match simple treachery. The man looked haunted, desperate, as if he were acting against his own will rather than from greed or malice. "There's something wrong," Clara said, continuing to observe Miguel through the spyglass. "He doesn't look like someone who wants to be there." Dasan studied the distant figure with professional interest. "Coercion, perhaps. Crane may have leverage over him that we don't understand." The observation planted a seed of doubt in Clara's mind about the true nature of Miguel's betrayal. But there was no time to explore such complexities. Their pursuers had spotted them on the ridge and were spurring their horses to close the remaining distance. "The river," Dasan said, pointing toward a silver ribbon of water that wound through the valley below them. "If we can reach it before they catch us, we might have a chance." What followed was a desperate race down treacherous mountain slopes, with loose rock and hidden ravines threatening to cripple their horses at every stride. Behind them, the pursuit had spread out in a line, trying to prevent any escape to either side of the valley. They reached the Rio Verde just as Clara thought their horses might collapse from exhaustion. But one look at the swollen river told her their problems had only multiplied. Spring snowmelt had transformed what should have been a manageable crossing into a torrent of brown water, carrying uprooted trees, boulders, and debris from upstream flash floods. "We have to cross here," Dasan said, studying the murderous current with professional calculation. "They're less than 10 minutes behind us, and if we're trapped on this side..." Clara understood without explanation. On this side of the river lay Crane's sphere of influence. His men could call on local resources, fresh horses, and reinforcements. But across the raging water-stretched territory, where his authority was weaker, and they might find allies. "Oh, how dangerous is it?" Jacob asked, his 7-year-old voice, barely audible above the river's roar. Dasan began rigging a rope system using techniques learned during years as a military scout. "Very dangerous. But staying here means certain capture, and that means death in Crane's minds. The crossing nearly killed all 3 of them." Dasan went first, fighting the homicidal current with powerful strokes, while paying out rope behind him. Even his considerable strength was barely sufficient to reach the far bank. And by the time he hauled himself onto solid ground, he was gasping and exhausted from the effort. Clara and Jacob came next, both clinging desperately to the guide rope while the river tried to tear them loose and dash them against the jagged rocks downstream. The water was shockingly cold despite the desert heat, and the current felt like invisible hands trying to crush them. Halfway across, something went catastrophically wrong. A massive tree trunk carried by the flood slammed into the rope system with tremendous force. The impact sent Clara spinning through the churning water, and she lost her grip on both the rope and Jacob's hand. Worse, the collision had attracted something else, a full-grown mountain lion that had been hunting along the riverbank and was now being swept downstream in the same deadly current. The big cat was panicking, claws extended, lashing out at anything within reach as it struggled to survive. Clara found herself between the desperate animal and the rocky bank, with Jacob somewhere behind her in the chaos. What followed was a nightmare of churning water, razor-sharp claws, and desperate gasps for air. The mountain lion, driven by pure survival instinct, raked deep gouges across Clara's shoulder as they both fought the river's violence. Through sheer desperation and the kind of strength that comes only from protecting someone you love, Clara managed to kick the mountain lion toward a different section of riverbank, while grabbing a floating log that kept her from drowning. The cat clawed its way to safety and disappeared into the underbrush, but Clara was rapidly losing her battle with the current. "Hold on." Dasan's voice cut through the chaos as he appeared downstream with a fresh rope, his movements showing the fluid coordination of someone who had rescued people from floodwaters before. The recovery took another 10 minutes that felt like hours, but finally, all three of them collapsed on the eastern shore, battered, hypothermic, bleeding from various cuts and scratches, but alive. Will they follow? Clara gasped, wringing muddy water from her hair while trying to ignore the burning pain from the mountain lion's claws. Dasan looked back across the raging river, where dust clouds marked the arrival of their pursuers. Even through the distance, they could see Miguel gesturing frantically as he tried to convince Crane's men that the crossing was possible. "Eventually," Dasan replied. "But crossing this flood will take them most of the day, even with Miguel's guidance. We've gained perhaps 6 hours." As they gathered their scattered supplies and tended their injuries, Clara reflected on what the river crossing had taught her. They weren't just fleeing from abuse anymore. They were fighting for their lives against forces that would stop at nothing to reclaim what they considered valuable property. But they were also discovering reserves of courage and determination they hadn't known they possessed. Jacob's quick thinking during the crisis, Clara's refusal to surrender despite facing death by drowning or mauling, and Dasan's unwavering commitment to their safety were forging them into something stronger than mere refugees. They were becoming a family bound not by blood or legal documents, but by choices made in moments of desperate need. And as they resumed their flight through increasingly rugged terrain, Clara began to understand that this bond might be the most powerful weapon they possessed against their enemies. The cave system extended deep into the mountainside, like the throat of some slumbering giant, its passages twisting through absolute darkness toward unknown destinations. Clara led the way with a torch made from pine branches and strips torn from her mother's old dress, following a crude map she had discovered among the locket's hidden contents. Apparently her mother had used these same caves during the family's wandering years. They had been underground for nearly 2 hours, fleeing from a dawn ambush that had caught them completely off guard. Somehow, despite the river crossing that should have delayed them for most of a day, Crane's men had managed to get ahead of their route and set up a killing field that covered all the obvious escape paths from their previous night's camp. Only a desperate dive into the cave mouth had saved them from certain death. But now they faced a different kind of peril entirely. "The air feels wrong." Jacob whispered, his young voice echoing strangely in the confined space. Clara had noticed it too, a subtle change in the atmosphere that made her lungs work harder with each breath. The torch flame was burning lower and with a different color than normal, flickering between yellow and sickly blue-green. Poisonous gas. Dasan said grimly, recognizing the signs from his experience in various mining operations throughout the territory. These old caves sometimes fill with deadly vapors from underground mineral deposits. The native peoples have stories about such places. They call them the breathing holes of sleeping earth spirits. "How long do we have?" Clara asked, though she dreaded the answer. Dasan studied the torch flames' behavior and noted the increasing difficulty they were all experiencing with breathing. Maybe an hour before we lose consciousness. Less if the concentration gets worse as we go deeper. Clara felt panic clawing at her chest, but she forced it down with the same determination that had carried her through the river crossing. They had survived Amos's brutality, Crane's pursuit, and a raging flood through clear thinking and mutual support that they could survive this too if they kept their wits about them. "The map shows another exit," she said, consulting her mother's crude drawing by torchlight. "But it's much deeper in the system, and we'd have to go through several chambers that might be even more contaminated." "What other choice do we have?" Dasan asked, already checking his ammunition in case they encountered their pursuers again at the cave's rear entrance. They pressed deeper into the cave system, but the poisonous gas was affecting them more severely with each step. Clara found her vision beginning to blur at the edges, and Jacob was stumbling frequently despite Dasan's steadying hand on his shoulder. Worse, they could hear voices echoing from behind them. Crane's men had apparently decided to follow them underground rather than wait for them to emerge. "Can't breathe properly." Jacob gasped, his 7-year-old body succumbing to the toxic atmosphere faster than the adults. Clara's mind was growing fuzzy from oxygen deprivation, but she forced herself to study her mother's map more carefully. There had to be something she was missing, some detail that would give them an advantage over both the poison gas and their human pursuers. Then she spotted it, a notation in her mother's handwriting that she had initially dismissed as unimportant. "Air shaft emergency, only dangerous climb, follow the star marks." Looking more carefully at the cave walls around them, Clara began to notice small symbols scratched into the rock, 5-pointed stars, barely visible in the flickering torchlight, leading toward a narrow crack she had previously overlooked. "Here," Clara whispered, pointing to the fissure that was barely wide enough for human bodies. "Mother left us a way out." The crack angled upward at a steep incline that would require them to climb rather than walk, but it might lead to fresh air and safety if they could manage the ascent before the poison gas overcame them completely. Dasan went first, helping to pull Jacob up the treacherous passage, while Clara pushed from below. The climb was exhausting under normal circumstances, but with their lungs struggling to process contaminated air, it became a nightmare of burning muscles and growing weakness. Behind them, the voices of their pursuers were getting closer, but they also sounded increasingly distressed. Crane's men were experiencing the same breathing difficulties, and some of them were apparently turning back rather than risk death from poisonous gas. "Almost there." Dasan called down from somewhere above, his voice tight with effort. "I can see starlight ahead." Clara felt a surge of desperate hope, but it was tempered by growing dizziness that made each handhold a struggle to maintain. If she lost consciousness during the climb, she would fall back into the poisoned cave and probably die before anyone could rescue her. "Jacob," she whispered to her brother, who was directly above her in the narrow passage. "Keep climbing no matter what happens to me." "No," Jacob replied with surprising firmness for a 7-year-old. "We stay together. That's what families do." His words gave Clara strength she didn't know she still possessed. With enormous effort, she managed to continue the climb until she felt fresh air flowing down from above, the most beautiful sensation she had ever experienced. They emerged from the cave system onto a high ledge that offered commanding views of the entire region, while remaining virtually invisible from ground level. More importantly, they could breathe normally again, and the color was gradually returning to their faces. But their escape from the poisoned caves had cost them precious time and energy. In the distance, Clara could see fresh dust clouds approaching their general area reinforcements for Crane's search parties, probably summoned by some prearranged signal system. "How many men does he have?" she wondered aloud. "Enough to make this personal," Dasan replied, checking his rifle and counting his remaining ammunition. But we have advantages he doesn't expect. Such as, Dasan pointed to a cache of supplies hidden among the rocks, another of her mother's emergency preparations. Inside were items that could transform their desperate situation, food, water, ammunition, and most remarkably, several sticks of dynamite left over from some long-forgotten mining operation. Your mother planned for every contingency, Dasan marveled as he examined the explosives. Even ones she couldn't have imagined when she hid these supplies. Clara felt a mixture of gratitude and grief as she realized the extent of her mother's preparations. The woman had clearly understood that dangerous times were coming for her children, and she had tried to provide for their survival even from beyond the grave. But there was something else in the supply cache that caught Clara's attention, another folded paper, this one sealed with wax, and bearing her name in her mother's distinctive handwriting. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal and read, "My dearest Clara, if you have found this cache, then you and Jacob have survived dangers I prayed you would never face. What I am about to tell you will be difficult to hear, but you must know the truth about your father's death and my own illness. Thomas Hartwell, your real father discovered that Silas Crane had been illegally mining silver from land that belonged to our family, a mining claim inherited from my father that we never knew existed. When Thomas threatened to expose Crane's theft and demand compensation, the mine owner arranged what appeared to be an accident. Your father was murdered. Clara killed to protect Crane's criminal enterprise. I married Amos Kettering not for love, but because Crane needed someone to watch our family and ensure our silence. Amos has been Crane's paid agent from the beginning, reporting on our activities and waiting for the right moment to eliminate any threat we might pose to their illegal operations. The sickness that is killing me as I write this is not natural. I believe Amos has been slowly poisoning me with arsenic, the same substance miners use to process silver ore. He knows I have begun to suspect the truth about Thomas's death, and he cannot allow me to investigate further or pass that knowledge to you. Hidden deeper in this cache, you will find proof of everything I have told you, the original mining claim, geological surveys showing the extent of the silver deposits, and evidence of Crane's illegal extraction activities. These documents are worth more than money, my darling daughter. They are proof of murder, theft, and conspiracy spanning nearly a decade. Use this knowledge wisely. But remember, you and Jacob are the only ones who can bring justice for your father's murder and my own. Trust Dasan, if he has come this far with you, for any man who would risk his life to protect children from Crane's evil has proven his worth beyond question. I love you and Jacob more than words can express. You are the finest things your father and I created together, and I know you will find the strength to see justice done. Your devoted mother, Clara, finished reading through tears of grief and fury, her hands shaking as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Everything she had suspected about Amos was true, and worse, he hadn't just been a cruel stepfather, but an active participant in her mother's murder and her father's assassination. What does it say? Jacob asked gently, seeing his sister's emotional state. Clara shared the letter's devastating contents, watching Jacob's face cycle through shock, anger, and finally a grim determination that reminded her how much her little brother had matured during their ordeal. "So Crane and Amos killed both our parents," Jacob said quietly. "And they've been stealing from us for years." "Not anymore," Clara replied, her voice carrying steel that would have impressed any adult. "Now we have proof of what they've done." But even as she spoke, Clara could see more dust clouds converging on their position from multiple directions. Crane had apparently committed significant resources to their capture, and their high position, while defensible, could also become a trap if they were surrounded. "What's the plan?" Dasan asked, studying the approaching forces through his spyglass. Clara examined the dynamite and began formulating a strategy that was audacious and desperately risky. They couldn't outfight Crane's overwhelming numbers in direct confrontation, but they might be able to level the playing field through careful use of explosives and terrain advantages. We make them pay for every step, she decided. And we make sure these documents reach someone who can use them to destroy Crane permanently. The plan they developed required precise timing and absolute trust in each other's abilities. They would use the dynamite to create landslides that scattered and confused their attackers, then fight a series of delaying actions while working their way toward the town of Dusty Fork itself, not to flee from Crane's power base, but to attack it directly when he least expected such audacity. It was the kind of desperate gamble that could easily get them all killed, but it was also their best chance of ensuring that the evidence of Crane's crimes reached the right people. As they prepared for what might be their final battle together, Clara reflected on how much she and Jacob had changed since their ordeal began. They were no longer helpless victims, accepting whatever adults decided to do with them, and they had become active participants in their own rescue and the pursuit of justice for their murdered parents. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent when the first of Crane's reinforcements appeared in the valley below. Clara took a deep breath, checked her grip on the detonator Dasan had rigged, and prepared to discover whether her mother's hidden preparations would be enough to keep them alive long enough to see justice done. The mining camp at Silver Creek stretched across a narrow valley, like the bleached skeleton of some enormous beast, its abandoned buildings and rusted equipment telling the story of boom turned to devastating bust. Most structures had collapsed or been stripped for salvageable materials, leaving only stone foundations and the dark mouth of a mine shaft that burrowed deep into the mountainside, like a wound that had never healed. Dasan had chosen their temporary refuge with tactical precision. The partially collapsed assay office provided cover from observation, while offering clear sight lines across the entire valley. More importantly, multiple escape routes led away from the building through networks of trenches and ore pits that would confuse pursuers and provide opportunities for ambush. Clara was binding a cut on Jacob's arm when movement in the distance caught her attention. Riders were approaching the valley mouth, not the scattered search parties they had been evading, but an organized column moving with military discipline and deadly purpose. "They found us again," she said quietly, alerting Dasan without wanting to panic Jacob. The Navajo warrior studied the approaching force through his spyglass, his expression growing increasingly troubled as he counted riders and assessed their equipment. 18 men, maybe 20, he reported. Well armed and moving like they know exactly where we are. Clara felt the familiar chill of approaching danger, but this time it was mixed with growing anger at the relentless pursuit that seemed designed to rob them of any chance at normal life. How did Crane's men keep finding them despite their best efforts at concealment and misdirection? The answer became clear as the riders drew closer, and Clara spotted a familiar figure among them, one that made her pulse race with recognition and bitter understanding. Miguel Santos. She whispered, hardly believing her eyes, but knowing it had to be true. Miguel was riding at the front of the column, clearly serving as their guide through country he had claimed to know better than anyone. But now, Clara could see something in his posture and expression that she had missed during their earlier encounters, the tight shoulders and haunted eyes of a man acting against his conscience. "The man who helped us at the trading post," Clara explained to Dasan, who was following her gaze with professional interest. "I trusted him completely." But as she watched Miguel pointing out landmarks to Crane's other men, Clara noticed details that didn't match simple treachery. The man looked desperate rather than triumphant, and he seemed to be arguing with someone, a hard-faced rider who kept gesturing threateningly toward Miguel while pointing at their hiding place. "There's something wrong," Clara said, continuing to observe through the spyglass. "He doesn't look like someone who wants to be there." Dasan studied the distant figures with the analytical eye of someone who had spent years reading human behavior in life-or-death situations. "Coercion," he confirmed. "Crane has leverage over him that we don't understand." The observation planted seeds of doubt in Clara's mind about the true nature of Miguel's betrayal. But there was no time to explore such complexities. The riders had reached the valley floor and were spreading out to surround the abandoned mining camp in a coordinated pattern that spoke of professional military experience. But then Clara spotted something that changed everything about their situation. Among the approaching men, she recognized a figure that made her heart skip with either hope or terror, she couldn't decide which. "That's Silas Crane himself," she breathed, pointing to a well-dressed man on a fine horse who was clearly directing the entire operation. Crane was not the rough, brutal figure she had expected from Amos's descriptions. Instead, he appeared almost elegant with expensive clothes and the bearing of a successful businessman. Only his pale eyes, visible even at this distance, revealed the predator beneath the civilized facade. Why would he come personally? Jacob asked his 7-year-old mind, grasping the significance, even if he couldn't understand the implications. "Because this has become personal for him," Dasan replied grimly. "We've cost him men money and reputation. He wants to finish it himself." As if summoned by their conversation, Crane's voice suddenly carried across the valley, cultured and conversational, despite the hostile circumstances. "Annie Clara Kettering," he called out. "I know you're here, child. Why don't you come out so we can discuss this situation like reasonable people?" Clara felt Dasan's hand on her shoulder, holding her in place, when her first instinct was to respond to what sounded like a reasonable request. "He wants to negotiate," she whispered. "He wants to capture you alive," Dasan corrected. "Men like Crane don't negotiate, they manipulate until they get what they want. Then they eliminate any remaining threats." But Crane wasn't finished with his performance. "I understand you've been carrying some interesting documents that belong to your mother." He continued, his voice carrying easily in the thin mountain air. "Papers that might relate to certain property disputes that have caused considerable confusion regarding mineral rights. Perhaps we could reach a mutually beneficial arrangement regarding those holdings." Clara's blood chilled with new understanding. Crane wasn't just hunting them because of their escape from his labor operations. He wanted something specific that he believed they possessed. Something valuable enough to justify this elaborate and expensive pursuit. "The mining claim," she whispered, pulling out the documents from her mother's cache. "He knows we have proof of what he's been doing." "What mining claim?" Jacob asked, but Clara was already examining the papers more carefully. Hidden among her mother's other documents was a legal claim registered in Colorado territory, 160 acres of mountain land that included mineral rights and water access. According to attached geological surveys, the land contained silver deposits estimated as some of the richest in the region. The claim was registered in Clara and Jacob's names as joint owners, with provisions that would transfer full control when Clara reached 16. More disturbing was a notation in her mother's handwriting. "This is the source of Crane's wealth, silver stolen from our family's land for nearly a decade. Thomas discovered the theft and threatened to expose it. Crane arranged my husband's accident to protect his illegal mining operation. Guard this proof with your lives. It's the only evidence that can bring him to justice." Clara's hands trembled as the full scope of the conspiracy became clear. Crane hadn't just killed her father to steal their mining claim. He had been using the theft to build his entire empire while keeping them in poverty and ignorance. "Dasan," she whispered urgently, showing him the documents. "This is why Crane wants us dead. We have proof he's been stealing from our family and that he murdered our father to cover it up." The Navajo warrior studied the papers with growing amazement and anger. "This explains everything, the pursuit and the resources he's committed, the personal involvement. These documents could destroy him completely, which means he'll never stop hunting us as long as we have them," Clara realized. "And we can never be safe unless we find a way to use them against him." But even as she spoke, she could see Crane's men positioning themselves for a final assault on the mining camp. The mine owner had apparently grown tired of negotiation and was preparing to take what he wanted by force. "And last chance, Miss Kettering." Crane called out, his cultured voice taking on a harder edge. "Surrender the documents and come with us peacefully, or my men will come in and take them from your dead bodies." Clara looked at Dasan and Jacob, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. They had come too far and learned too much to surrender now, especially with proof of their parents' murders in their possession. "What's the plan?" Dasan asked, checking his rifle and counting ammunition one final time. Clara studied the layout of the abandoned mining camp, noting the positions of Crane's men and the terrain features that might work to their advantage. An idea began forming, dangerous and dependent on split-second timing, but potentially devastating if executed properly. "We use his greed against him," she said, pointing to the dark mine shaft that led deep underground. "He wants these documents so badly he'll follow us anywhere to get them, even into a trap." The plan they developed was complex and required perfect coordination, but it offered their best chance of survival against overwhelming odds. Clara would lead Crane's men into the mine tunnels while Dasan and Jacob prepared a reception committee using the remaining dynamite from her mother's cache. When the charges detonated, the tunnel system would collapse in a way that eliminated their pursuers while leaving the family an escape route through natural caves that connected to the mountain's backside. It was still incredibly dangerous, but it was their only realistic option against such superior numbers. "Remember," Clara told Jacob, as they prepared to implement their desperate strategy, "we're not just fighting for ourselves anymore. We're fighting for our parents and for everyone else Crane has hurt over the years." Jacob nodded solemnly, understanding that they had become something more than just victims fleeing from abuse. They were the only witnesses to murder and systematic theft, and they carried evidence that could bring Crane's entire criminal enterprise crashing down. As the sun touched the western peaks and long shadows began creeping across the valley floor, Clara took a deep breath and prepared for what she knew would be their final gamble against Silas Crane. The battle for justice was about to begin, and there would be no second chances if they failed. The assault on the mining camp began with methodical precision as Crane's men advanced through the deepening twilight, their weapons glinting in the last rays of sunlight like deadly promises. Clara watched from her concealed position near the mine entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs as she prepared to play the most dangerous role of her young life. Everything depended on her ability to act as convincing bait, drawing Crane's forces into the tunnel system, where Dasan and Jacob had rigged their explosive trap. But as the first group of gunmen approached her hiding place, Clara noticed something that made her stomach twist with fresh understanding of Miguel's betrayal. The Mexican laborer wasn't just guiding Crane's men, he was leading them with obvious reluctance, his face showing the haunted expression of someone acting against his deepest convictions. When he pointed out potential hiding places, his gestures were hesitant. And when he spoke to the other men, his voice carried no enthusiasm for the hunt. "The girl will try for the mine shaft," Miguel called out in accented English, but Clara caught something in his tone that the others missed, a subtle emphasis that sounded almost like a warning. "She is clever, but she thinks like a child who believes darkness will protect her." Clara felt a spark of hope cut through her anger. Miguel's words could be interpreted as helpful guidance for Crane's men, but they could also be read as advice for her: stay away from the mine entrance, because that's where they expect you to go. But there was no time to puzzle out the complexities of Miguel's divided loyalties. The first group of gunmen was close enough now that she could hear their whispered communications as they coordinated their approach. "Remember," their leader said, a scarred man with cold eyes and steady hands. "Crane wants the girl alive if possible. She's got information he needs before she can be disposed of." "What about the others?" another voice asked. "The boy and the Indian Crane says they're expendable obstacles." Clara's blood turned to ice at the casual way they discussed murdering Jacob and Dasan. These men saw her 7-year-old brother as nothing more than an inconvenience to be eliminated, a child who had never hurt anyone, and whose only crime was being born into the wrong family. The cold calculation in their voices steeled her resolve. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about stopping people who treated children like disposable objects, to be used and discarded according to their convenience. She waited until the gunmen were positioned exactly where Dasan had predicted they would be, then emerged from hiding with her hands raised in apparent surrender, playing her role with the desperate skill of someone whose life depended on the performance. "Don't shoot," she called out, putting just the right note of frightened submission in her voice. "I want to make a deal with Mr. Crane." The scarred leader kept his rifle trained on her, while signaling the others to maintain their positions, but Clara could see uncertainty in his eyes. Children weren't supposed to negotiate, they were supposed to cower and obey. "Where are the boy and the Indian?" he demanded. "Gone," Clara replied, which was technically true since they were deeper in the mine system preparing their surprise. "They abandoned me when they realized I was slowing them down." It was a calculated lie designed to make the gunmen overconfident and careless. If they believed she was alone and abandoned, they might not maintain the careful tactical formations that could complicate her escape. "Mr. Crane will be pleased," the scarred man said, lowering his rifle slightly. "He's been looking forward to a private conversation with you, Miss Kettering." Clara allowed them to escort her toward the main camp. But as they walked, she was memorizing positions and counting numbers. 18 men total, all armed with rifles and pistols, moving with the discipline of experienced fighters. The odds were impossibly bad for direct confrontation, but Clara had never intended to fight them openly. Silas Crane rose from a folding chair beside a campfire as they approached, his pale eyes studying Clara with the calculating interest of a man examining valuable but dangerous merchandise. "Miss Clara Kettering," he said with mock courtesy that didn't disguise the predator beneath. "How delightful to finally make your acquaintance after our extended game of chase. I trust your journey here wasn't too arduous." Clara met his gaze without flinching, drawing on reserves of courage she was still discovering within herself. "What do you want from me?" Crane smiled, but the expression never reached his cold eyes. "Direct and to the point. I admire that in a child, though I suspect you've been forced to grow up far too quickly. What I want, my dear, are certain documents that belong to your mother papers relating to mining claims that have caused considerable confusion regarding property ownership in this region." "I don't know anything about mining claims." Clara lied with practiced smoothness. Crane's smile faded into something more dangerous. "Please don't insult my intelligence, Miss Kettering. Your mother was Thomas Hartwell's widow, and your father discovered something that belonged to me, something he had no right to interfere with before his unfortunate accident." "You mean the silver you've been stealing from our family's land for years?" Clara asked, abandoning all pretense. The direct accusation hit its mark. For a moment, Crane's civilized facade slipped to reveal the ruthless killer beneath the expensive clothes and cultured speech. "Stealing is such an ugly word," he said softly, his voice carrying the menace of a coiled rattlesnake. "I prefer to think of it as efficient resource management. Your father was going to waste those deposits on foolish dreams of legitimate mining operations. I put them to much better use building something substantial and profitable. By murdering him when he threatened to expose your theft." Crane's eyes narrowed dangerously, but he seemed to find Clara's boldness more interesting than infuriating. "Your father died in a mining accident, Miss Kettering. These things happen frequently in our dangerous industry. Perhaps you should be more concerned about avoiding a similar fate." Clara could see the cold calculation in his expression, shifting toward immediate violence. He had apparently decided that she knew too much to be allowed to live, regardless of what documents she might possess. But before he could give orders to his men, commotion erupted from the direction of the mine entrance. One of Crane's guards appeared at the edge of the firelight, breathing hard and looking concerned. "Sir," the man reported urgently, "we've got problems. Miguel found fresh sign heading into the tunnels, but something's not right about the tracks. They look deliberate, like someone wants us to follow them. Clara felt a surge of hope mixed with confusion. Miguel was still helping Crane track them, but his report suggested he was also trying to warn them about the obvious trap they had set. Crane studied his subordinate's report with professional interest, his tactical mind working through the implications. How many sets of tracks leading into the mine? Hard to say, sir. The ground's been disturbed deliberately, could be one person or half a dozen. Take 10 men and investigate. Crane decided after a moment's consideration. But proceed with extreme caution. These people have already proven they're more resourceful than we initially anticipated. As the guard departed with half of Crane's remaining forces, Clara realized their plan was developing exactly as intended. With his men divided between multiple locations, Crane would be vulnerable when the explosives detonated and chaos erupted throughout the camp. But then Miguel Santos stepped forward from the shadows, his betrayal apparently complete, despite the subtle warnings he had been trying to provide. "Mr. Crane." The Mexican laborer said, his voice tight with some emotion Clara couldn't identify. "I know these children better than your other men do. Perhaps I should supervise the search of the mine tunnels personally." "Excellent suggestion." Crane agreed readily. "Take another 3 men and coordinate with the advance team. I want this matter resolved tonight." Clara watched in growing despair as Miguel led another group toward the mine entrance, knowing that if he reached Dasan and Jacob before the trap could be triggered, their entire plan would collapse in disaster. She had to do something to delay Miguel's advance and give her makeshift family time to complete their preparations. But what could a 9-year-old girl do against armed men without revealing the trap's existence? The answer came from her own anger at what she perceived as Miguel's complete betrayal of their trust. "You're making a mistake trusting him." Clara called out, her voice loud enough for everyone in the camp to hear clearly. Crane turned back to her with raised eyebrows, intrigued by this unexpected development. "I beg your pardon." "Miguel Santos." Clara continued improvising desperately, while drawing on every lesson she had learned about manipulating adults during her years with Amos. "He's not working for you exclusively. He's been reporting to federal marshals about your operation." It was pure invention, but Clara delivered it with the conviction of absolute truth, adding just enough plausible details to make it sound convincing. "Why do you think he asks so many questions about your business methods? Why was he so interested in the names of other children you've purchased?" Miguel spun around, his face flushed with genuine anger and fear. "That is a lie," he protested, but Clara could see uncertainty flickering in the faces of Crane's other men. "I have served Mr. Crane faithfully. Then why did you try to warn us at the trading post?" Clara pressed gambling everything on her ability to create doubt and confusion. "Why did you tell us about safe routes that just happened to lead us away from your employer's strongholds?" The accusation contained just enough truth to be devastating. Miguel had indeed given them advice that helped them avoid some of Crane's patrols, though Clara now suspected his motives had been more complex than simple betrayal. Crane studied Miguel with renewed suspicion, his paranoid mind working through the implications of Clara's claims. In his business, betrayal was always a possibility, and he had survived by trusting no one completely. "Perhaps," Crane said slowly, "we should postpone the tunnel search until we can clarify Miguel's true loyalties." "Sir, there is no time for such delays." Miguel began desperately. "There's always time to avoid walking into federal traps." Crane interrupted coldly, his pale eyes boring into Miguel with deadly suspicion. "If Miss Kettering is telling the truth about your divided allegiances, then rushing into those tunnels could be exactly what the authorities want us to do." Clara felt a mixture of triumph and terror. She had successfully delayed Miguel's advance toward Dasan and Jacob, but she had also made herself more valuable to Crane as a source of information about potential federal investigations, which meant he would be even more determined to keep her alive for interrogation. Tell me more about these federal marshals. Crane demanded, his voice carrying the silky menace of a predator who had cornered valuable prey. Clara's mind raced as she tried to construct a plausible story that would buy more time without revealing their actual plans. But before she could answer, the night exploded with a roar of detonating dynamite. The charges Dasan and Jacob had planted went off in a carefully timed sequence, creating a chain reaction that brought down half the mountainside in a thunderous avalanche of rock timber and mining equipment. The ground shook beneath their feet like an earthquake, and dust clouds billowed across the valley like an enormous brown fog that blotted out the stars. In the chaos that followed, Clara saw her chance. As Crane's men struggled to maintain their footing and understand what was happening to their carefully organized operation, she dove toward the nearest cover and began working her way toward the predetermined rendezvous point where Dasan and Jacob would be waiting if they had survived their own explosive trap. Behind her, she could hear Crane roaring orders to his scattered and disoriented forces, trying to regain control of a situation that had suddenly turned completely against him. But Clara was no longer listening to his commands. She was focused entirely on reaching her chosen family and escaping this nightmare once and for all. The final phase of their desperate gamble was about to begin, and everything would depend on whether their makeshift bonds of love and loyalty could survive the ultimate test of fire and violence that awaited them in the town of Dusty Fork. The town of Dusty Fork sprawled across the desert valley. Like a malignant growth, its ramshackle buildings and industrial smokestacks creating an ugly scar against the pristine wilderness that surrounded it. Clara had never seen the place before, but its oppressive atmosphere was immediately apparent, even from their concealed position on a rocky outcrop overlooking the settlement. This was a company town, where everything and everyone served the interests of Silas Crane's mining empire. From their vantage point, Clara could see the heart of Crane's operation, a massive silver extraction complex that dominated the landscape with its towering headframes, processing buildings, and enormous piles of excavated ore. Steam engines chugged day and night, hauling endless loads of rock from deep underground, while workers moved through the facility like industrious ants serving their queen. But what Clara found most disturbing was how normal everything appeared on the surface. The workers emerging from the morning shift moved with energy rather than the defeated shuffle she had expected from virtual slaves. Many carried personal belongings and engaged in animated conversations that suggested they had some agency in their lives. There were even legitimate businesses operating apparently independently of the mine, a general store, a saloon, a small church, with territorial flags flying outside. Something's different about this place, Clara said, voicing her growing confusion as she studied the town through Dasan's spyglass. It doesn't look like the kind of company town where everyone lives in terror. The decision to come here had been born of desperation rather than strategy. After their explosive escape from the mining camp, they had hoped to find refuge in the remote wilderness. But Crane's pursuit had been relentless and increasingly well coordinated. Every route they tried led to another ambush. Every settlement they approached turned out to be under Crane's influence or control. Finally, Dasan had convinced them that their only hope of permanent safety lay in attacking the source of their persecution rather than simply fleeing from it. As long as Crane has power and unlimited resources, he'll never stop hunting us, Dasan had explained during their 3-day journey through increasingly hostile territory. But power like his depends on fear control and the ignorance of those he exploits. If we can show his workers and the territorial authorities what he's really been doing, we might be able to turn his own empire against him. Before Clara could respond to her own observation about the town's apparent normalcy, Jacob pointed toward a group of riders approaching Dusty Fork from the east. Look, more people coming, but these are different. Clara counted 8 mounted men moving with military discipline toward the town's main street. But as they drew closer, she realized these weren't more of Crane's mercenaries. They wore the uniforms and badges of federal law enforcement, riding with the confident authority of people who represented legitimate government power. U.S. Marshals. Dasan confirmed, studying the approaching lawmen through his own field glasses. The lead rider is William Hayes. I knew him during my Army scouting days. He's one of the few honest lawmen in the territory, which means this isn't a routine visit. Clara felt a surge of hope mixed with wariness. If federal authorities were finally investigating Crane's activities, it might mean their desperate flight was almost over. But it could also mean they were about to be caught in the crossfire between federal power and local corruption. As they watched, the marshals rode directly to Crane's administrative complex and dismounted with weapons ready, their movements coordinated and purposeful. Whatever was happening, it was clearly a planned operation rather than a casual investigation. "Should we go down there?" Clara asked, clutching the documents that proved Crane's crimes. "If they're arresting him, we could provide testimony about everything he's done." "Too dangerous until we know more," Dasan replied carefully. "Those could be honest marshals, or they could be more of Crane's people wearing federal badges. We need to see how this develops before we commit ourselves." But Clara had already made up her mind. After weeks of running and hiding, the chance to see Crane face justice was too important to miss. Moreover, if genuine federal officers needed evidence of Crane's criminal activities, she and Jacob were probably the best witnesses available. "I'm going closer to see what happens," she announced, starting down the rocky slope before anyone could stop her. Dasan caught up quickly, but instead of arguing, he simply adjusted their approach to minimize risks while acknowledging Clara's determination. "If we're doing this, we do it carefully," he said. "Stay behind me, move quietly, and be ready to run if everything goes wrong." They made their way down the hillside as evening shadows began gathering, using the growing darkness and the town's own activity to conceal their movement. As they reached the edge of Dusty Fork's commercial district, they could hear raised voices coming from Crane's office building. "Silas Crane, you're under arrest for violation of federal laws regarding kidnapping, trafficking in persons, and conspiracy to deprive citizens of their civil rights." Marshal Hayes's voice carried clearly through the evening air, formal and implacable. But the response wasn't immediate surrender. Instead, gunfire erupted from multiple windows as Crane security forces engaged the federal officers in a battle that sent townspeople scrambling for cover and turned the main street into a war zone. "Get down," Dasan commanded, pulling Clara and Jacob behind a heavy water trough as bullets began flying in all directions with deadly randomness. What followed was unlike any of their previous encounters with Crane's men. This was a full-scale siege involving dozens of participants, with federal deputies taking disciplined positions behind solid cover, while Crane's forces responded from fortified locations within the administrative complex. The sound of rifle fire echoed off buildings like thunder, punctuated by shouted orders and the crash of breaking glass. But as the battle raged around them, Clara began noticing something unexpected developing on the periphery of the conflict. Groups of mine workers were emerging from their housing and gathering in the streets, but instead of fleeing from the violence, they seemed to be organizing for some kind of coordinated action. "They're going to join the fight." Jacob observed his sharp eyes, catching details the adults had initially missed. Indeed, Clara could see workers arming themselves with mining tools and moving to positions that would cut off Crane's escape routes. The federal intervention had provided a catalyst, but the workers themselves were transforming it into something larger, a genuine uprising against years of exploitation and abuse. This was the opportunity they had been hoping for, but Clara realized they needed to act quickly to ensure the rebellion succeeded. While everyone's focused on the main battle, she said, "We can get into the records building and destroy those labor contracts. If the workers are going to be free, they need proof that their bondage was illegal." Dasan started to object, but Clara was already moving, using the chaos and confusion to work her way toward Crane's stronghold. The administrative building was surrounded by gunfire, but a rear window had been shattered by stray bullets, providing an unguarded entry point. She slipped inside to find herself in what appeared to be a records room, filled with filing cabinets and document boxes, exactly what she had been hoping to find. If the contracts binding workers to Crane's service existed anywhere, they would be here along with evidence of his other criminal activities. Working quickly by lamplight, she began searching through files, and what she discovered was even worse than she had imagined. Not just dozens of contracts involving children sold into virtual slavery, but evidence of systematic fraud forgery and coercion spanning years of operations. There were bills of sale for human beings, forged immigration documents, and records of bribes paid to territorial officials. She was stuffing the most incriminating documents into a canvas bag when footsteps in the hallway alerted her to approaching danger. Multiple people were coming, and from their urgent conversation, they were definitely hostile. Clara looked desperately for another exit, but the room had only one door and the window she had entered through. She was trapped with evidence that could destroy Crane's empire, but no obvious way to get it to safety. Then she heard a voice that made her blood freeze with recognition and fury. Check every room systematically. Silas Crane was ordering, his cultured voice tight with desperation. Those federal idiots may have gotten people inside while we were distracted by their theatrical arrest warrant. Clara pressed herself against the wall behind a large filing cabinet, hoping shadows would conceal her presence, while her mind raced through possible escape strategies. Through a gap in the cabinet doors, she could see Crane himself entering the room, flanked by 2 armed guards who looked ready to kill anyone they found. The mine owner looked haggard and desperate, his expensive clothes torn and stained with smoke from the battle raging outside. But his pale eyes still burned with the same calculating determination that had made him so dangerous, and Clara could see that he was far from defeated. "Sir," one of his guards said nervously, "maybe we should consider evacuating through the back tunnels. Those marshals aren't giving up, and it sounds like some of our own workers are turning against us." Crane's face twisted with rage at the suggestion of retreat. "I'm not abandoning everything I've built because of federal interference and ungrateful employees," he snarled. "This is my town, created with my vision and my capital. If they want to take it from me, they'll have to pry it from my dead hands." He walked directly toward the filing cabinet where Clara was hiding, and she held her breath, certain that discovery was only moments away. But instead of searching behind the cabinet, Crane opened one of the drawers and began pulling out documents of his own contracts and property deeds that represented the legal foundation of his power and wealth. "Help me secure these in the vault," he ordered his guards. "If the Federals want evidence of wrongdoing, they'll have to work much harder to get their hands on it." Clara watched in growing alarm as Crane gathered the very documents she had hoped to destroy or steal. If he managed to lock them in his office vault, they would be beyond anyone's reach, and federal investigators might never be able to prove the full extent of his crimes. She had to act, but what could a 9-year-old girl do against 3 armed men in a confined space? The answer came from an unexpected direction. Through the broken window, she could hear Jacob's voice calling out to someone in the street with desperate urgency. Clara went into the records building. "She's trying to get the contracts, but there are men with guns in there with her." Clara's heart sank. Jacob was trying to help, but he was also alerting everyone within earshot to her presence and location. Within seconds, both Crane's men and hopefully some of the rebelling workers would know exactly where she was. But then she heard something that changed the entire dynamic of the situation. And the sound of many boots running through the building, accompanied by voices she didn't recognize, but that carried the rough accents of working men rather than professional killers. "The contracts are supposed to be in here," someone shouted with authority. "All the labor documents according to what we heard from that Mexican fellow." The doorway suddenly filled with mine workers armed with picks, shovels, and other tools that could serve as weapons. They were led by a man Clara had never seen before, a grizzled veteran of underground work whose face showed years of dangerous labor and growing anger at the system that had exploited him. But what Clara recognized immediately in all their faces was the same determined fury she had felt when she first understood Amos's plan to sell her and Jacob into slavery. These were people who had discovered they had been lied to and cheated for years, and they were ready to do something about it. Crane spun around in shock, his pistol coming up to fire at the intruders, but before he could squeeze the trigger, Clara made her own contribution to the rebellion. She pushed against the filing cabinet with all her strength, using leverage and desperation to send the heavy furniture toppling forward. It crashed into Crane and his guards with tremendous force, pinning one guard beneath its weight and sending Crane sprawling across the floor with documents scattered around him like fallen leaves. "Get the papers," Clara shouted to the workers as she scrambled out of hiding. "Everything in those drawers, contracts, deeds, all of it. These are the documents that have kept you in bondage." What followed was systematic destruction as the rebellious miners began feeding Crane's records to fires they built in metal waste baskets. Years of legal documents that had bound families in poverty and children in virtual slavery went up in smoke, along with property records and financial ledgers that represented the mine owners' accumulated authority over their lives. Crane struggled to his feet, blood streaming from a head wound where the cabinet had struck him, his pale eyes now wild with desperate rage and the dawning realization that his empire was crumbling around him. "You fools!" he screamed at the workers, his cultured facade finally cracking completely. "Do you think destroying papers changes anything? I'll simply create new contracts, I'll bring in replacement workers, I'll rebuild everything exactly as it was." His threats were cut off by the arrival of Marshal Hayes and 2 federal deputies, their badges gleaming in the firelight from the burning documents. The lawmen had fought their way through Crane's defenders and were now surveying the scene of systematic document destruction with professional interest. "Thwarn, Silas Crane," Hayes announced formally, "you're under arrest for multiple violations of federal law, including but not limited to kidnapping, human trafficking conspiracy to defraud the United States government, and violation of territorial labor regulations." But as the marshals moved to place Crane in custody, Clara spotted movement that made her blood freeze with terror and recognition. Miguel Santos had appeared in the doorway behind the federal officers, and he was raising a rifle with shaking hands, not toward Crane, but toward Dasan, who had just entered the building. "Miguel, no," Clara screamed, finally understanding the terrible complexity of his situation. But Miguel was already pulling the trigger, his face streaming with tears as he carried out what was clearly the most agonizing decision of his life. The shot caught Dasan in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into the wall. Before Miguel could work the rifle's action for a killing shot, Jacob acted with the quick thinking and desperate courage that had kept them alive throughout their entire ordeal. The 7-year-old grabbed a heavy mining lantern from a nearby desk and hurled it at Miguel with all his strength. The glass chimney shattered against the man's head, covering him with burning oil that set his clothes ablaze and sent him stumbling backward in pain and terror. "Stop!" Miguel screamed as he beat at the flames. "You don't understand. They have my daughter. Crane has been holding my little girl hostage. I had no choice." The revelation hit Clara like a physical blow. Miguel hadn't been betraying them out of greed or malice. He had been forced to choose between their lives and his own child's safety. It was the same impossible situation that had driven so many other parents to make terrible decisions under Crane's system of exploitation and control. Federal marshals quickly extinguished the flames on Miguel's clothes and took him into custody. But Clara could see in Marshal Hayes' expression that he understood the tragic nature of Miguel's position. This was a man who had been caught between 2 different kinds of evil and had tried to find a way to protect everyone he cared about. "Where is your daughter now?" Hayes asked Miguel with unexpected gentleness. "In the mine compound." Miguel gasped, his burns painful but not life-threatening. "Building 7. She's only 6 years old. Please, you must help her." Hayes immediately dispatched deputies to locate and rescue Miguel's daughter, while Clara knelt beside Dasan to assess his wound. The bullet had passed through his shoulder without hitting bone or major blood vessels, but he was losing blood, and would need medical attention soon. Is it over? Jacob asked his young voice, carrying the hope of someone who had been afraid for far too long. Clara looked around at the scene of their victory. Federal marshals arresting corrupt officials, workers celebrating their newfound freedom, smoke rising from the destruction of the legal instruments that had oppressed them for years, and Silas Crane himself, in chains, his empire reduced to ashes and memory. Yes, she said, pulling Jacob into a fierce hug while helping support the wounded Dasan. I think it really is over this time. But even as she spoke the words, Clara knew their story had one final chapter yet to be written, the discovery of their parents' true legacy, and the resources that would allow them to rebuild their lives and help other children escape similar fates. The nightmare that had begun with Amos's drunken brutality was finally ending. But their real journey toward healing and justice was just beginning. 3 weeks after Silas Crane's arrest and the liberation of Dusty Fork, Clara sat beside the stream that ran behind their temporary cabin, carefully examining the last hidden contents of her mother's locket, while the afternoon sun painted the New Mexico landscape in shades of gold and amber. The sound of Jacob's laughter mixed with the gentle murmur of water flowing over smooth stones, creating a peaceful symphony that seemed impossible after everything they had endured. Dasan's shoulder wound was healing well under the care of a genuine doctor who had arrived with the federal investigation team, and he had been officially appointed as Clara and Jacob's guardian through proper territorial legal proceedings. For the first time in their young lives, they had someone who saw them as children to be protected and nurtured, rather than burdens to be endured or assets to be exploited. But Clara's analytical mind couldn't let go of certain mysteries that still nagged at her consciousness. Her mother's final message had mentioned resources hidden where you would least expect them, and Clara suspected she hadn't discovered all of her mother's preparations yet. Working with patient determination over several days, she had discovered that the locket contained additional secret compartments beyond those she had already opened. Using careful pressure and a thin knife blade, she finally managed to access the deepest recess, where she found documents that would transform everything she thought she understood about their family situation. The first item was the mining claim she had seen before, but examining it more carefully revealed details that took her breath away. According to updated geological surveys hidden with the original papers, the land contained silver deposits that were not just valuable, but among the richest ever discovered in Colorado territory. Conservative estimates suggested the claim was worth enough money to make them wealthy beyond anything Amos could have imagined. But it was the second set of documents that made Clara's hands tremble with shock, grief, and blazing anger. It was a detailed confession written in her mother's careful handwriting, apparently composed during her final illness. My beloved Clara and Jacob, if you are reading this, then I am gone, and my worst fears about our situation have proven justified. What I am about to tell you will be difficult to bear, but you must know the complete truth about your father's death and my own murder, for that is what this illness truly is. The stomach pains, the weakness, and the strange dreams that have preceded my approaching death were not caused by natural sickness. I am convinced that Amos has been slowly poisoning me with arsenic, the same substance miners use to extract silver from raw ore. I have found traces of the powder in my food and detected its bitter taste in my water. He is killing me as surely as if he had used a knife or a gun. Why would he commit such a monstrous act? Because he knows about the mining claim your real father discovered before his death, and he understands that you children will eventually inherit wealth that could destroy his arrangement with Silas Crane. Thomas Hartwell, your true father was a good and honest man who discovered that Crane had been operating an illegal mine on our family's land for years, stealing silver deposits worth a fortune while keeping us in deliberate poverty and ignorance. When Thomas threatened to expose the theft and demand legal compensation, Crane arranged the mining accident that took his life. Amos Kettering has been Crane's paid agent from the very beginning of our acquaintance. He married me not for love, but because Crane needed someone to monitor our family and ensure our continued silence about the stolen silver. Everything about our life together has been a lie designed to protect Crane's criminal enterprise. But now that you and Jacob are growing old enough to potentially discover the truth and claim your rightful inheritance, both men have decided you pose too great a risk to their conspiracy. They plan to eliminate you as soon as they can arrange circumstances that won't attract unwanted attention from territorial authorities. However, your father was cleverer than they realized. Before his death, he secretly extracted and processed significant quantities of silver from our claim, creating a hidden cache that Crane never discovered. The location is marked on the detailed map included with these papers. This treasure, combined with the legal claim itself, will give you resources to seek justice and build the kind of lives Thomas and I always wanted for you. Use this inheritance wisely, my darling children. Remember that you have the power to change the world for other children facing similar dangers. Your parents' deaths will have meaning only if they lead to protection for innocents who have no one else to fight for them. I love you both beyond words. You are the finest gifts Thomas and I ever created together, and I know you will find the strength to see justice done and to build something beautiful from the ashes of our family's tragedy. Your devoted mother, Sarah Hartwell. Clara finished reading through tears that combined grief for her murdered parents, with fury at the men who had destroyed her family for profit. Everything she had suspected about Amos was true and worse. He hadn't just been a cruel stepfather, but an active participant in both her parents' murders, serving as Crane's inside agent throughout their entire relationship. What does it say? Jacob asked gently, seeing his sister's emotional state and moving closer to offer comfort. Clara shared the letter's devastating contents, watching Jacob's face cycle through shock, anger, and finally, a grim determination that showed how much her little brother had matured during their ordeal. So Crane and Amos killed both our parents. Jacob said quietly, his 7-year-old voice carrying weight that no child should have to bear. And they stole from us for years while keeping us poor and afraid. But not anymore. Clara replied, her voice carrying steel that would have impressed any adult. Now we have proof of everything they did, and we have the resources to make sure other children never suffer the same way. There was still one more item in the locket's deepest compartment, a small leather pouch that clinked softly with the sound of heavy coins. Inside were gold pieces, worth more than Amos had ever seen in his worthless life, along with a final note explaining their significance. This gold represents samples from your father's secret mining operation, processed silver, that proves our claim's incredible value, while providing immediate resources for whatever challenges you might face. More importantly, Thomas hid a much larger cache of refined silver in the location marked on the enclosed map. This treasure will make you independently wealthy and give you the power to help others who find themselves trapped by poverty and desperation. Remember always that this wealth comes with moral obligations. You have been given advantages that most children lack, and those advantages must be used to protect and uplift others who face the kinds of dangers you have survived. Build something good from our family's suffering, my beloved children. Make our deaths count for something larger than mere revenge. Clara felt a dizzying sense of possibility opening before them as she absorbed the full implications of their inheritance. Not only were she and Jacob free from the threat of exploitation, but they possessed resources that could secure their futures and help countless other children trapped in similar circumstances. We're really rich. Jacob asked, hardly believing what he was hearing. "And we're free." Clara corrected, understanding that wealth without freedom was just another kind of prison. "And we have the means to help other children become free too." Dasan, who had been listening quietly to their discoveries while resting his healing shoulder, smiled with genuine warmth and pride. "Your mother was an extraordinary woman," he said. "She saw far into the future and prepared for contingencies she couldn't have imagined in detail. As Clara carefully secured the precious documents, she reflected on the incredible journey that had brought them to this moment. They had begun as terrified victims fleeing from abuse and exploitation. But through courage, determination, and the help of someone who chose to see them as worth protecting, they had become something far more powerful. They were survivors who had refused to accept victimhood. They were witnesses to crimes who had successfully sought justice. They were inheritors of wealth who understood that privilege came with responsibilities. Most importantly, they were a family bound not by accident of birth, but by shared struggle, unconditional love, and a commitment to protecting others who couldn't protect themselves. "Nok, what will we do now?" Jacob asked, looking toward a future that suddenly contained unlimited possibilities. Clara looked at Dasan, seeing in his weathered features the same protective determination that had saved their lives and given them hope. Then she looked at Jacob, seeing in his young face the intelligence, courage, and compassion that would help them use their advantages wisely. "We'll claim our inheritance," she said with quiet confidence. "And then we'll use it to build something that honors our parents' memory, while making sure no other children suffer what we suffered." "That's an ambitious goal for a 9-year-old, Dasan observed with gentle humor. "I'm not just 9 anymore." Clara replied with the kind of wisdom that comes only from surviving the impossible. "I'm someone who has faced evil and chosen to fight it. Someone who has been given power and intends to use it to protect others. Someone who understands that the best way to honor the dead is to save the living." As the afternoon sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Clara felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders, not the crushing burden of mere survival she had carried for so long, but the uplifting challenge of using their good fortune to benefit others who had no champions to defend them. She was no longer Clara Kettering, unwanted stepdaughter of a drunk and a murderer. She was Clara Hartwell, daughter of parents who had died fighting injustice, inheritor of wealth that came with moral obligations, and big sister to a boy who had proven himself brave and wise beyond his years. The ordeal that had begun with beaten children on a dusty road had ended with those same children possessing the resources and determination to change the world for others facing similar challenges. "Dasan," she said, as they prepared to return to their cabin and begin planning for their journey to Colorado, "will you teach us everything we need to know about mining operations, business management, and helping other children?" The Navajo warrior's smile carried the warmth of genuine family love mixed with respect for the remarkable young people Clara and Jacob had become. "I will teach you everything I know about everything that matters," he promised. "And together, we'll make your parents' hopes and dreams become reality." As they walked toward home through the gathering twilight, Clara carried with her the knowledge that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new opportunities to honor her parents' memory, while protecting children who had no one else to fight for them. Some stories, she reflected while watching the first stars appear in the darkening sky, did have endings that justified all the pain and struggle that came before them. But the best stories didn't really end at all. They transformed into new beginnings that carried their lessons forward into a better future. She was ready for whatever came next.